Hey guys, this is my drive rant. I figured today, for fun, I would address something a little more light than condemnation and damnation and so on. A lot of folks that I've spoken to in the time that I have been a believer, which is honestly as long as I can remember, not that I've been good at this. This is something I think only recent, but and even then I still don't feel I'm all that good at it. Anyhow, some folks believe in this, young earth creationist thing where the earth is only as old as the dates that go back to the time of Adam and Eve in the garden, which is, at this point right at about 6,000 years. The issue with that is there's, even though we're not supposed to take the physical evidence of the world over the evidence of the Bible, and I do believe there's evidence in the Bible that I'm going to explain here, that shows the earth is actually very ancient. We can glean from the fact that much has gone on, like literally under the surface of the soil, dinosaur bones and so on, among many other things, that kind of prove that this place is much older than that particular view. The 6,000 year, young earth creationist view is actually silliness. And I don't mean to be offensive to those that believe this stuff, but here's the thing. We have a long history, at least in this country and in the West, of strongly misunderstanding the first two verses of the Bible. So the opening phrase in Hebrew is Bereshith, which literally means, it doesn't mean in the beginning. The idea of putting a preposition in the beginning of a sentence in Hebrew is like non-existent. So to assume anything would say in the beginning, on top of all things, positional location first, doesn't make sense. That being said, it is more appropriately translated before all else. But then, we get this description in verse 2 of the earth being what's called tohu wa bohu, I think is the phrase. And essentially the King James actually has it the best. Without form and void. So in other words, the picture is, in verse 2 that, there's no light. God's Spirit is brooding over the surface of the waters, and everything is like a giant round ball, very much pointing to a flood of all things, which, out of waters, from the waters, was everything formed. So it only makes sense that, God would make use of such a complete terminal judgment, probably after some sort of, series of raining of fiery stones on the earth, hailstones, comets, whatever, to kill off whatever was there beforehand. Which, to me, kind of points to the time when the angels would have had a time to rebel. I don't think the angels, being without the ability to feel, or have any sinful flesh or consequences of losing their physical life, at least at that point, because there's no indication anywhere in the Bible that God had threatened, before the creation of the earth, or at least overtly. Daniel does talk about hell being filled from the throne of God when the Son of Man stands before the Father. But that likely happened right before the recreation, if not right after. I say recreation specifically because the 7 days point to God taking his time for a purpose. Not that he needed 7 days to refill the earth, or that he, needed things to catch up, or because a day is not long enough. If we're looking at like evolutionary adaptation scientifically, it's not enough to explain why he would take an exact 7 days, except for, see my video on the 7,000 years of man, that it is a roadmap showing God filling up the family of God by sequential 1,000-year days of man. So the thing for me too in the Hebrew that really sends this home is the conjunction phrase, or the conjunction and, that is usually between verse 1 and 2. That is a wow, a wav. I think it's vav or wav. I'm trying to remember that, but basically W-A-W is the transliteration into English, and essentially that is a, not to get too technical because this will be hard to explain, but I am going to actually read off from the doctor's reading so that you guys have a little more direct knowledge. But that is essentially, it's not an and, it's a but. So it's like a harsh transitional going from one thing to another, because like if we look in each of the 7 days, he essentially creates everything instantly. Like he formed the man out of the earth. It doesn't say it took him any specific amount of time. It says he took some clay, made the man, and breathed his spirit into him, and he was a full-grown nephesh, a full-grown person. He wasn't a child, he wasn't an infant, he wasn't infantile, he wasn't non-understanding. He was a fully functional, ready to reproduce adult. So when God creates, he creates in wholeness and then builds in reproduction as an additional factor for reproduction. I guess I'm being redundant there. Forgive me. So what we have is, in the first verse, a picture of what's called ex nihilo creation, out of nothing creation. So God snapped his fingers, spoke, however you want to see it, he spoke. That's what's literally described. And in Job, I believe 38, we have a picture of the angels rejoicing at the creation of the earth. But if it says before all else, that means he created the heavens and the earth first, and then all of the creatures that filled it, either as a consequence or directly thereafter. So the picture is that the angels had already existed when the 7 days of recreation were performed, and that they were rejoicing because they knew that it was God's answer to Satan's rebellion. What this is all pointing to is perhaps millions, maybe billions of years of the world's existence before man existed as a willful creature. And does this mean that there were like cavemen? Maybe. We don't know. But we do know when we look in the New Testament, based upon what, the demons that were honest anyway, the ones that we had Christ had direct experience with, they had a very strong fascination with bodies. Remember the demoniac at Gadara? He asked if he could be thrown, they asked if they could be thrown into the pigs, even though they were essentially, put to the pig's death and then left without a body yet again in a torturous, judgmental fashion. So it stands to reason, at least to me, that part of Satan's original plan and ploy to get the third of angels that joined him, the third of the stars that were cast down with him, to join him, was the promise of being able to, act as they please, basically transgress all of the likely rules that they were given in protecting the holiness of God's original design. Because remember, in Ezekiel, he talks about he was supposed to protect the holiness of God's mountain, and instead decided to profane it. So, him touting taking over bodies and genetically manipulating people like they did in Genesis 6, that's a real thing. They say that, the angels had like intercourse with humans, but that would denote that they had bodies, and they don't have bodies, right? And there's no sign that Antichrist, for example, is going to be, a direct result of actual fornication between angels and humans, but it doesn't disclude or discount the potential for it having been a genetic experiment, and not to say that we know for certain, because the Bible's not explicit on these things, but everybody wants to know where dinosaurs came from. Maybe dinosaurs were the same type of experiment as the Nephilim in Genesis 6. And this is a maybe, guys. I don't know this stuff for sure. I do know that there is really no proof in human history, although some like to claim, Behemoth and Leviathan and all that stuff, these large sea creatures, were dinosaurs, but there were no land-walking dinosaurs in any and all of recorded human history. And something so severe and so extreme that could easily, I'm sure, destroy any number of men all at once, considering how gigantic they were, when we put their structures together. And even then, we're probably wrong about that. Humans are wrong about a lot of stuff. But the times where we find like an entire skeleton laying down, that's kind of hard to deny that these things weren't gigantic, monstrous, and probably capable of severe carnage. And who's to say, and I'm, again, just spitballing here, but who's to say that the Nephilim weren't letting their bodies be taken over by angels so that they could experience their, spiritual, miraculous capacity? Also be cool, because I'm sure a lot of people today are demon possessed that are into all kinds of weird stuff on the same type of lines, minus the whole genetic manipulation. And it would totally explain like the trans movement and all that, and the absolute lunacy that some of these people allow themselves to get to. But it would also explain why the entire original earth was judged so severely and brought to the point of being void and utterly flooded, in my opinion. It's formless and void. So it's a giant round ball. What else could it be? Flooded past the highest mountain peaks, it would just look like a giant ball from an outside view. And God's Spirit is brooding over the waters. And again, verse 2 is actually very clear, at least in my opinion, translation-wise, in the King James. Not the biggest King James fan, but King James did nail that, at least the second verse. It didn't get the end part right, and it didn't get the in the beginning part right. But that was also, up to that point, I believe, starting to become the more popular translation for that particular verse, Genesis 1:1, I mean. And a lot of translations today have continued on in that tradition, because I don't believe it's an I don't believe it's a very good translation of Bereshith. I believe that's a very everybody else is doing it, why can't we translation. So also one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of the King James, but also most of the other major variations out there. So what this all points to me, and I think the Bible is pointing to it honestly, is that there was a gigantic gap in time between Genesis 1 and 2, and that the angels, being that they are essentially eternal in nature, took much longer to come to their full fruition of rebellion than humans do. You know, because we have all the pressures of life, and we're weak in flesh and our minds and our sinful nature. We have a much easier time jumping ship and rebelling God and becoming satanic than most of the angels. Obviously, Satan was the original liar. He was a murderer from the beginning. He basically led to the eventual utter destruction of the third that joined him, and is responsible for proffering sin among man. Obviously, he was the one to come and test Eve. But God knew all of this the entire time, and man and Christ was ever in his plan, because once the third of angels left, the family of God was no longer complete, and God is all about wholeness and completeness. So it only stands, again, to reason that God first saw this. He was in the same way he is with us relative to the lifespan, if you will, of angels, because if he would have let them go on forever, they would have just continued on, because they're eternal, don't have bodies. Hopefully this is all making sense. I'm going to actually start working on this information and breaking down the entire satanic rebellion, because I think that's something that would totally explain the situation that we're in, and why Satan is so vested in coming after us. So anyhow, I'm going to leave it where it is and get into the technical stuff now. But like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll talk to you guys soon.